Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. What kind of leverage does China's presence in Cuba have over the U.S.? From Chinese spy bases to talks of Chinese troops stationed there, national security alarm bells are ringing. This comes just after Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit in Beijing with Xi Jinping. As for how our allies and countries on the fence of who to side with view this, we hear from John Sitilides, U.S. State Department diplomacy consultant and geopolitical strategist, for insight. John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be with you again, Tiffany. Thank you for having me.
There's a new national security concern that Chinese troops could be as close as 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This is after the Wall Street Journal just published a report based on former and current U.S. officials saying that China and Cuba are in talks for a joint military facility there. So what kind of leverage would this give China?
Significant leverage in one context, and that it places Chinese facilities and potentially Chinese troops, as we recall from the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s, 90 miles off the coast of Key West in Florida. However, I think it's important to place this in a larger context, if I might, Tiffany, and that is that the Chinese government conducts significant espionage activities inside the United States already for a number of years, whether it's these police stations that were uncovered in New York City several weeks ago, whether it's the coercion of a number of Chinese students in colleges in the United States and threatening harm to their families back in China if they don't cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's spy balloons that we allow to fly over the United States, and frankly, even satellites in outer space that are constantly monitoring the U.S. and a number of activities in which China is interested. We need to be able to speak to Havana very forthrightly, I would say, and let them know in the case of worsening tensions between China and the United States, say over a Chinese invasion or assault against Taiwan, that Cuba would be potentially a military target of the United States for housing Chinese facilities and possibly Chinese troops in a possible Chinese base 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
And John, to your point, it seems like a lot of analysts were concerned about this listening base that reports were saying China has in Cuba. But it sounds like it's much closer to home. They're already in the United States. But in terms of the recent revelations of the Chinese spy base in Cuba, how do you see this now joint military base? Are they related? Are they separate?
I think the intelligence is still being pieced together. I'm not sure we have a conclusive sense of what exactly is happening, probably just a few snapshots here and there, Tiffany. But this is a very serious matter. And I think what's very ill-timed about this particular report for the purposes of Chinese activities is that it comes, as you correctly note, right after or right as Secretary of State Blinken, having pleaded for a meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing for months, finally gets one. We're still unclear as to what the outcome of that meeting is, but the timing of this bodes very, very poorly for sort of strong U.S. posture towards Beijing across a whole range of issues for which Beijing is almost singularly responsible for worsening the U.S. China relationship.
And John, on the note of Blinken's Xi Jinping visit in Beijing, it seems both sides are saying, oh, there were talks about stability. There are, sides that they don't agree on, but they're trying to really focus on sides they can agree on. And some are noting this is a halt to the downward spiral in relations. How do you view that relationship after the visit, but also in light of all these Cuba revelations?
In terms of substance, Tiffany, I would say the relationship is almost completely unchanged. And the problem here is that China has in many ways declared, if not an open war against the United States, there are a series of documents and open speeches by General Secretary Xi Jinping before the Communist Party of China and by other Chinese officials, and that they are determined to replace and to supplant the United States as the global leader, as the dominant economic and military power, essentially by 2049. We don't take these documents and these pronouncements very seriously, neither in the United States nor in most of Europe, unfortunately. Unfortunately, Secretary Blinken was not able to achieve military-to-military communications, which seem to be very high on the U.S. agenda. But I'm also very concerned about the optics here, Tiffany, in that it looks as if it was the U.S. alone that wanted desperately for this meeting to take place, and there was never any public sort of sense from China that they were desperately seeking this type of a rapprochement with the United States in any way. Although in many ways, China needs this more than the U.S. does, given the fact that its economy is reeling right now post-COVID lockdowns. There are a number of domestic issues with which Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party need to focus. But this gives the Chinese people a sense from the Chinese Communist Party, unfortunately and mistakenly, that China is calling the shots and not the United States.
And John, on that note, it's not only China that was watching those optics, but also U.S. allies and countries that are maybe on the fence about who to side with, whether the U.S. or China. So given that, what must the U.S. do to either keep or convince these countries to maybe choose the U.S.?
We need to be able to demonstrate to our allies that the United States is serious about projecting strength and confidence in our foreign policy, that our foreign policy priority is not managing U.S.-China relations, but in advancing and strengthening U.S. national interests and those of our allies, and deterring China and other adversaries around the world. And then you can place U.S.-China relations and policy in that context of strengthening America and our allies, deterring China and our foes.
John Sitilides, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you again for having me, Tiffany.